Yes.
So before I deal with the last couple of documents relating to the arrangements with Scotland, there's just one document I wanted to go to in response to a query you raised, which was about the question of whether purchasing responsibility transferred from Dr. Main to the blood transfusion service. I'm afraid it doesn't really answer the question, but it does deal with the issue. It's BHCT 40501. And it's a memo, an Eastern Health and Social Services Board memo dated the 25th of October 1984. It says supply of blood products. It's been agreed that with effect from the 1st of December 1984, all of the blood products as identified on the attached schedule must be obtained from the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, and none should be purchased or obtained by a UMG directly. Local arrangements should be negotiated with Dr. McClelland, Director Blood Transfusion Service. The difficulty is we don't have the schedule, and we're not currently certain what a UMG is. But it appears that there was some local change in arrangements from December 1984. It doesn't appear that Dr. Main's role was thereby rendered redundant in any sense, and she certainly appears to regard herself as being primarily the responsible person for treatment policy and choice of products.
It was this change that I had in mind, but you're right, it doesn't necessarily answer the questions.
So then just returning to the position in relation to the arrangements with Scotland, if we could go to LOTH 605_071. So as well as the overall arrangement that we've seen, which was upon introduction of the pro-rata distribution system, Northern Ireland started to send plasma for fractionation in Edinburgh and receive Edinburgh product in return. There's an exchange of correspondence which shows a time-limited other arrangement. This is a letter from Dr. McClelland of the Edinburgh and South East Scotland Regional Blood Transfusion Service, not to distinguish it from Northern Ireland, to Dr. Ludlam, says, Peter Brainian has just pointed out to me that we're continuing to receive substantial deliveries of PFC factor 8 from Belfast. I was indeed aware that you had on one occasion made an exchange with Dr. Main for some commercial factor 8 which you had previously purchased, but I did not know that the process was continuing. So far as I know, our stock level is low. Indeed, the total stock situation within the NSBTS is at present very healthy, and I wonder if there is some specific reason why the exchanges with Belfast are still necessary. And obviously I'm concerned that there may be some difficulty in our local supply situation, which I'm not aware of. And then if we go to Dr. Ludlam's reply, it's LOTH 605_085. It's a letter dated the 11th of January 1984 from Dr. Ludlam to Dr. Brian McClelland. Thank you for your letter of the 30th of December about exchanges of commercial factor 8 with Belfast. The exchange was agreed early in 1983 because at that time SMBTS factor 8 was in very short supply. The first part of the exchange arrived shortly after the negotiations, and at the time SMBTS material markedly improved. The material that has arrived recently just completes the exchange. As I understand it, we are now quits with Belfast. So it appears that, as it were, on top of the overarching arrangement as between Northern Ireland and the PFC in Edinburgh for the supply of plasma and fractionation, there was agreed in 1983 between Dr. Ludlam and Dr. Main directly, an arrangement whereby Dr. Ludlam sent commercial factor 8 to Dr. Main, and Dr. Main sent back to Edinburgh PFC factor 8. And the explanation for it is what we see set out there.
Well, it's not really an explanation of why it happened, but it's I understand that there may have been a shortage in Scotland, an anticipated shortage, at any rate, that Professor Ludlam was keen to maintain all his patients, as far as he could, on locally donated product. That same could not be true of Northern Ireland because there have been a variety of products used. Hence his saying, well, if you send me back some of mine, I'll give you some of my commercial.
Yes. Whether that resulted in a further spread of different commercial concentrates being used for individual patients in Northern Ireland in 1983 is a matter of speculation, but it could have been a consequence of that. So what one can see what Dr. Ludlam had to gain from the arrangement, to put it colloquially. It's less clear what Dr. Main might have had to gain from the arrangement because she was giving up NHS in favour of commercial.
Yes, that was the year that quite a lot of Factor 8, Armour Factor 8, started to be used.
It was, yes.
In Belfast. I don't know if that's the product that was sent over or not.
We don't know, at least not from the documentation we've seen so far.
Yes.
Just then, completing the picture in relation to arrangements with Scotland and moving to the supply of heat-treated products, if we go to, it should be PRSE 302675, I think. So this is a letter, 6th of December 1984. It's from Dr. Perry, and it's addressed to transfusion directors, but it sets out what's going to be supplied in terms of heat-treated product. So it's headed heat-treated Factor 8. I've learnt today that the first infusions of our dry-heated Factor 8 were successful in Edinburgh, although we're yet to receive the recovery and half-life data on the 4 recipient patients. In the realistic anticipation that this data will be acceptable, I've made arrangements for the first batches of Factor 8 to be dispatched to RTCs, that's regional transfusion centres, as follows. And then we can see there the reference to Belfast. So there's an anticipated supply of 661 vials of heat-treated Factor 8 from Edinburgh to Belfast. And then in the paragraph below, he says, our calculations indicate that these quantities will provide approximately 1 month's supply for each region and will be dispatched to Belfast and then various Scottish centres by Red Star delivery on 10 or 11 December. PFC, and then the references there to what will be supplied to Edinburgh and Glasgow. Following this initial supply of heated product, plans are in hand to supply quantities of heated product to each RTC, equivalent to twice the min-max stock level, to take account of the need to replace domestic and blood bank stocks. This phase will commence in the latter half of the week beginning the 10th of December and should be complete before Christmas and should enable continuous supplies of heated product to be made available to patients after 10th of December. Over the next page. In the new year, PFC will arrange for non-heated product to be collected from RTCs, and I would request you make arrangements for this material to be recalled as widely as possible in preparation for this replacement programme. Unfortunately, we've not achieved regional batch dedication for the initial deliveries, although this will be achieved subsequently. So that was the plan in December. We don't know the precise date upon which heat-treated Scottish product began to be available in Belfast. But
yes, that would have been the product which was heat-treated in anticipation that the treatment would remove any HIV, HTLV3 infectivity, but it had made no expectations of reducing the hepatitis risk.
That's right, sir, and you'll recall that this was the subject of some questioning in relation to Professor Ludlam, because of that was the product that was then used over the next period until a further product became available in Scotland, and there was the question as to whether there should have been recourse to the BPL product.
Yes, because the Scots were roughly 18 months behind England in introducing a product which was thought likely to reduce, and shown ultimately to reduce, the risk of hepatitis.
Yes. Yes, so it would seem from this that the certainly in the early part of 1985, and you'll recall Dr. Main's completion of that survey for Professor Bloom reflects this, at least by April 1985, the heat-treated factor VIII concentrate that Dr. Main is using is the concentrate supplied by Scotland. Whether that changed and she was able to access any BPL heated product over the following months or 18 months or so is unclear. There is then a discussion, I think need to go to all the documents, but there's a discussion in correspondence about the PFC's intended production of their later product, Z8, and there's correspondence which contemplates that Dr. May may be asked to assist with the assessment of that in November 1986. If we go to PRSE 40129, Seamus. And if we go to, should be page 39, I think. That's a long document. Yes, this is a letter, February 1988, from Dr. Main to Dr. Perry at SMBTS. It shows, it picks the picture up essentially from July 1987. So she says in relation to, in the second sentence, treatment commenced, that's the Z8 factor 8, which was dry heated at 75 degrees for 72 hours, I think. Treatment commenced shortly after receipt of factor Z8 in July of last year. To date, some 28 patients have been treated on many occasions with 7 batches. There's only been one adverse clinical reaction, and then there's details of that particular clinical reaction, which was someone in the Children's Hospital developing clinical jaundice and blood results in keeping with non-A, non-B hepatitis. There are later letters, I don't propose to go into the detail of the individual patient's position, but there are later letters which suggest that that patient, in fact, may have had an older generation product that hadn't been heat treated to the same degree, and those documents are referenced in our note. So by 87, it would seem a number of patients being treated with Z8, so the later,
from the middle of 87.
By the middle of 87, yes, by the later generation. Obviously, that 28 patients doesn't represent all of the patients within the Belfast Centre. There is a further exchange of correspondence in 88 about another potential switch between NHS and commercial product between Dr. Main and Professor Ludlam. And again, it may just be instructive to look at that. If we start with Dr. Main's letter at NIBS 301762, this is a letter dated the 26th of September 1988, which Dr. Main wrote to Dr. Ludlam. There's thank you for both, I'm not sure who the both are, for coming over to Belfast last week. I do think that the meeting was very worthwhile. The allocation for Scottish NHS Factor 8 to Northern Ireland is 1.8 million units per annum. After our discussions with, and she identifies 3 people, of whom the third is the MLSO we've seen referred to elsewhere, I feel it would be appropriate and possible on a short-term basis to allocate approximately 1 million units of the Northern Ireland allocation to the Lothian Health Board. In return, the Eastern Health Board here should receive the equivalent number of Factor 8 units in the form of Profilate for use in our regional centre. And then there's a suggested date. And then she says, however, I feel that our situation should be kept under close review by both of us, because since we met, I've learnt that supplies of Profilate are likely to be in shortfall by the end of this calendar year. Furthermore, complications may arise with this product, or indeed a safer product may become available. Therefore, it would be unwise to be obtaining more than monthly supplies of Profilate. And if we go over the page, the letter continues. I'm happy for us to try this arrangement as long as the treatment of the children here and the small number of other patients is safeguarded. I've discussed this with John Carville, and in the meantime we'll run down our usage of NHS material and gradually change the home treatment over to Profilate. And then she says this: it would be interesting to see the reactions of the patients to this changeover, and to see if the number of units consumed is reduced. And then there's reference to there being sludge left in some of the return bottles which arrive with the MLSO for disposal. So the proposal is that, again, there'll be essentially a swap, and some of the Scottish NHS Factor 8, which would have been sent to Belfast, will be kept in Edinburgh, and in exchange, Edinburgh will provide Prophylate to Dr. Main. There's one further letter in which this is discussed again.
But there's also the implicit suggestion there that the patients will not have been asked in advance. It is going to be given to them, and they wait to see what their reaction is.
Yes, there doesn't appear to be any suggestion of an element of choice.
No. Yeah, there's an element of using the patients as, to an extent, guinea pigs. I don't mean in the sense of having a different treatment, but in the sense of having a different product.
Yes. There's a letter that was written September 1988. There's a letter November 1988 from Dr. Main to Professor Cash on the same issue at NIBS 301767. Where she says this, I understand from Dr. Maurice McClelland and Dr. Chris Ludlam that you've been anxious to discuss the present somewhat ad hoc interim arrangements regarding exchange of NHS Factor 8 vis-a-vis Prophylate. May I explain the situation to you as it's arisen? On September the 5th, 1988, at the Reference Centre Directors meeting in London, Chris Ludlam indicated to me that there would be a shortfall of NHS material in Scotland and that it would be necessary to top up needs with commercial Factor 8. The alpha product Prophylate was mentioned. In view of the widespread discussions regarding alterations in immunological tolerance in multi-transfused patients, I made a suggestion to Chris. There exists in Scotland children and other patients who've only been exposed to the NHS donor population. They've never received commercial concentrate at any time. In Northern Ireland up until 1985, all patients except children were exposed to commercial Factor 8. Therefore, I suggested to Chris that it might be worthwhile to consider an exchange basis to enable all patients who had never received other than NHS Factor 8 to continue to do. I would be happy to let them have my allocation of NHS Factor 8, barring the needs for the children here and one or two patients who were in the same category as those in Scotland, namely never exposed to commercial material. During the past few years, I have used Prophylate for replacement therapy during surgery, etc., and was happy to make some arrangements which would be beneficial to the majority of patients in both situations, i.e. Northern Ireland and Scotland. Since September, various discussions have taken place between other centre directors, and I understood that there was no bar to this arrangement. It's not envisaged on a permanent basis, and indeed one seeks to review it, e.g. its workability, etc., in January 1989. It was felt appropriate to try it out until the end of the financial year. Over the page, I'm sorry to learn from Dr. McClellan that there may be difficulties in carrying this out. Maurice has suggested to me that you would like a letter sent from the Eastern Health and Social Services Board here to the CSA in Scotland, making a formal request for the arrangements to be carried out. I am reluctant to do this, as I feel it would appear that I was requesting commercial Factor 8 in preference to NHS Factor 8, which is essentially exactly what was happening. That is not the case. The arrangements were made purely and solely to try and produce the best therapeutic benefit for the most patients. However, it must be said that one or two patients here have a strong preference for the Scottish material, and they are balanced by one or two who are delighted to have commercial material in the form of Prophylate rather than to receive any donations from Edinburgh. I look forward to having further discussions with you as soon as convenient. So how that was resolved again is unclear, but that was, again, a further arrangement proposed between Scotland and Edinburgh and Belfast for an exchange of Scottish NHS material, which would be retained in Scotland, and commercial material which would be used in Northern Ireland. And in terms then of other products that were used during the 1970s or first half of the 1980s, We've seen reference in the annual returns to the use of porcine factor 8. And the litigation report prepared by Dr. Main for the HIV litigation addresses the use of porcine factor 8 in more detail. It's Cbla 5072_024. And if we go to page 10, I think, Seamus. Yes, so we can see in the first main paragraph she refers to animal factor 8 concentrates, sets out a number of matters of history in terms of their usage. If we go further down the page, she refers then in 1981 to a new polyelectrolyte fractionation process, and we see that referred to in some of the documents as the PE process, for the production of a pure porcine factor 8 was developed. She explains it was used to treat a patient with a high-responding inhibitor in 1981, and the reference there is Main et al., so used, I think, in Belfast. Further extensive experience reported by Kernoff et al. The porcine material was found to be efficacious to a high degree in patients whose inhibitor was less reactive against porcine 8 than against human 8. Despite suitability, treatment could not be continued indefinitely due to the development of refractoriness or the occurrence of reactions. Many of the latter were mild, such as slight chills or the occasional skin rash, but as with other treatments, a few patients developed asthma attacks or anaphylaxis. However, some patients were and are able to use the porcine factor 8 for home treatment. Its advantages are the lack of known viral transmission, and its disadvantages are the limited suitability and occurrence of side effects. So that's Dr. Main's views as expressed in her May 1990 report about porcine factor 8. And we saw its use from the annual returns. And there's a further Spaywood document. I don't propose to go to it, but it's, again, the details are set out in our note, which record that Belfast was Spaywood's largest customer for porcine factor 8 in 1983. It's also right to note that obviously it was being used predominantly for inhibitor patients, possibly solely for inhibitor patients, and Dr. Main records elsewhere that Belfast had a relatively high number of patients with inhibitors. So that may reflect its fairly extensive usage within Belfast. Sticking with this report, Dr. Main then goes on to talk about other products. So she refers in the next paragraph to FIBA or Fiber, I'm not quite sure how the acronym is pronounced, from Immuno, and Autoplex from Baxter. And she says many patients do respond to such treatment, but it's not effective in all cases. And again, we've seen both of those products featuring on the annual returns. And then in the next paragraph, she refers to DDAVP, and she says, bottom of the page, or towards the bottom of the page, this agent has proven to be of value in treating patients with mild to moderate haemophilia or the von Willebrand syndrome. It is administered by slow intravenous injection, and a fourfold rise in the level of factor 8 can be expected above the starting basal level. Such response is sufficient to allow the performance of dental or minor surgery without recourse to plasma products. And then she sets out some perceived disadvantages, says it's not advocated in older patients, and so on. Again, we've seen from the annual returns, DDAVP is mentioned, but comparatively infrequently, and not. Well, the annual returns don't suggest it was being used to a significant extent in Belfast. She refers in the next paragraph to tranexamic acid. So if we go further down the page, paragraph beginning in female patients with the von Willebrand syndrome, and then she refers in the course of that paragraph to the use of tranexamic acid, and suggests that that has a place in von Willebrand cases and in mild and moderately affected haemophiliacs as well, particularly in relation to dental care. So that's the available evidence in relation to other blood products, other treatments, non-blood products. I should then just touch upon what Dr. Main says in relation to self-sufficiency as a topic. We can pick that up, first of all, again in her litigation report. So I think we're already on that document. It's Cbla 5072_024. Yes, it's a long document, so let me just find the right page number. I think it's probably page 20, Seamus. We go to the next page. Yes. So under the heading, the economics of self-sufficiency, Dr. Main sets out, if we go further down the page, towards the end of the first long paragraph, in the last 5 or 6 lines of this paragraph, she says, sustaining self-treatment was and is costly in terms of factor concentrate purchase, but hospital savings were and are substantial. So she's suggesting an economic benefit to self-sufficiency. And says in the next paragraph, picking it up 3 lines down from the top, thus the accrued savings from decreased hospitalisation, from non-payment of social services benefits for patients in gainful employment need to be balanced against the capital and revenue expenditure required to achieve self-sufficiency status and the outlay for purchase of factor concentrates. And then over the page, she talks about the stance of the UK Haemophilia Centre directors from their annual general meetings towards the issue of self-sufficiency. She says that at the earliest of their annual general meetings, 1969 onwards...
Just pause there for a moment. Just puzzling over the economics there, because what she's referring to, if we go back a page, and looking at the bottom to the study by Schimpf, this requires a patient to be treated. The issue, economic issue for self-sufficiency is whether the costs of providing it within the nation state are less than the overall costs of bringing it in. But there's no question about not having treatment. In other words, the money you save by having someone fully working is saved anyway. It's not a choice between commercial product or self-sufficient product, is it?
No, I mean I'm simply reading Dr. Main's words.
I know, but I'm just commenting on the logic, because it just suddenly struck me that it's not really an argument.
Yes. Yes.
However,
I can see that.
That's what she's putting out here.
It's the view she was expressing in 1990. Yes.
Yes. Well, it's a viewpoint which, at the moment, I'm struggling to see that it does actually make a valid point. This part of it.
Over the page, she then sets out the perspective of Haemophilia Centre directors in relation to self-sufficiency. She talks about it having been reflected on and discussed constantly at UK HCGO annual general meetings. She says that self-sufficiency was and still is a desirable goal, but achievement is easier in theory than in practice. She says different problems affected treaters, consumers and producers. And then the treaters had difficulty in making accurate forward estimates of the need. Treatment efficacy caused consumer demands to ever multiply. And then she explains the shift from responding to emergency bleeding episodes through self-treatment programs, elective surgery and the like. If we go to the bottom of the page, she refers to the collection of statistics in Oxford and says in the last 3 lines, the figures are not absolute. They do not represent each and every unit of factor rate given as treatment in any one year. Inevitably, over the years, a minority of treatment centres were tardy in submitting data, and indeed the submitted figures may not be precise, as on occasions haemophiliacs were and still are treated periodically outside the recognised haemophilia centres, thus with loss of data to the records. However, they do illustrate the clear-cut trends of treatment, and then she refers to various published estimates from Biggs in 1978 onwards, if we go to the next paragraph, she talks about so apart from estimation of need, which she's identified as a problem, other problems concerned the producers in the plasma fractionation centres in Oxford, Elstree and Scotland. They concerned source plasma in respect of quality and quantity, the changing technology necessary to improve the purity of product, the availability of manufacturing facilities and necessary organisational changes. And so in the next paragraph, she talks about the need to introduce modifications into blood transfusion practice to increase quantity of plasma available. And then if we go over the page, picking it up in the second paragraph, she refers to the Haemophilia Centre directors during 1974 expressing further anxiety regarding self-sufficiency, feeling the Department of Health was slow to realise the full implications of non-achievement of self-sufficiently, reference to concerns about the scaling up of production. Bottom of the page, she says, towards the end of 1975, you'll see there a paragraph number, and there are various paragraph numbers referred to throughout this report. They are references to one version of the statement of claim in the HIV litigation that she's commenting on. So she says, towards the end of 1975, it was suggested that Scotland could supply more Factor VIII to aid the self-sufficiency programme. However, during prolonged subsequent negotiations, it transpired that a shift system of staffing would be necessary to render the suggestion operational. Such arrangements were unacceptable to trade union policies then in operation, thus causing further delays in a possible field of improvement. Other highlighted difficulties were in the collection, transport and delivery of plasma to the Plasma Fractionation Centre in Edinburgh. And you see in brackets that's said to be based upon personal recollections, i.e. her own recollections of discussions at the time. And then in the next paragraph, she deals with financial input and says, if the organisational difficulties and plasma supply problems were to be set aside, the fiscal element in the achievement of self-sufficiency then becomes the most pertinent problem. If the Department of Health had provided further financial support at an earlier time, would this have accrued significant patient benefit? The reply is probably in the affirmative, is her view. She then gives the example of the Netherlands and the overall HIV infection rates there, and notes that 95% of the blood product used there was obtained from domestic volunteer donors. In respect of the numbers of haemophiliacs needing treatment in the UK, could scaling up of production, etc., have been achieved sufficiently rapidly to achieve a similar result? And then her answer is this. Instinctively, the treaters of the haemophiliac patients would feel it to be likely, but it is by no means certain. So whether feeling it to be likely is to be equated with likely as distinct from certain is not entirely clear from this. And then she says it's recognised that the supply of volunteer donors is not inexhaustible. So those were Dr. Main's observations in what was obviously a report, an expert report prepared at the request of the Department of Health in the HIV litigation. In terms of her more recent reflections, in her witness statement, if we could turn to WITN 0736009. And if we could go to, I think it's page 59, Shomik. Yes, so she was asked further questions about her views on self-sufficiency, in particular in light of what she'd said in the HIV litigation report. And at the top of the page, you'll see, she says, in the early to mid-1970s, discussion rotated around the financial and practical difficulties in upgrading the facilities at Elstree and at Oxford, but I do not remember precise details. And then she says, from and around this time, self-sufficiency was a constant item on the agenda. However, it seemed to me that haemophilia generally and self-sufficiency in particular was a low priority for government. As soon as the representative from the Department of Health became knowledgeable and was sympathetic towards the problems of haemophilia, they seemed to be deployed elsewhere. And then if we go towards the bottom of the page, she says at paragraph 96.3, supply of factor concentrates became the issue once they were commercially available. And then she says this, and again, so whether this is consistent with what the other documentary evidence suggests is a matter for you. But she says in this statement, in order to meet the centre's need for factor VIII, I endeavoured to procure as much NHS concentrate as possible. There were 3 sources of NHS concentrate, BPL at Elstree, Oxford Fraction Centre and SNBTS Edinburgh. And then she refers to, in the next paragraph, to the arrangement put in place with Edinburgh. In 1982, it was arranged that plasma from Northern Ireland donors be sent to Edinburgh SNBTS. An appropriate reciprocal amount of NHS concentrate will be returned to Belfast. Doing the best I can to recall, initially the NHS supply of concentrate was in the order of 10% of the amount used. Over time, this increased significantly, but I'm unable to be precise. It is true to state that Northern Ireland never became self-sufficient in NHS concentrate. The aforesaid arrangements were put in place as it was unrealistic to establish a plasma fractionation unit in Northern Ireland. She then refers in the next paragraph to 2 documents, both of which we've looked at in the course of the morning. And then if we go to page 65, and we pick it up in paragraph 104.1, she says, Northern Ireland was self-sufficient in the supply of cryoprecipitate at all times. However, supplies of NHS concentrate were never sufficient to meet demand. We received limited quantities of concentrate from Elstree and Oxford, although this was largely on the basis of the good relationship I had with Dr. Lane and Drs. Bidwell and Grant, respectively. From 1982, Northern Ireland had an arrangement with SNBTS for the supply of NHS concentrate from PFC. The amount of NHS from PFC increased in the following years. I'm unable to say at this time what proportion of concentrate used in the Belfast Centre was NHS concentrate. The remainder was from commercial concentrates. I would add that I believe the NHS suppliers did an excellent job with the limited resources they had. And then she was asked in the next question whether she thought a significant contributory factor was a failure to provide accurate and timely estimates of future demand. And of course, that was one of the very points she'd made in the HIV litigation report. However, her response in this statement is to say, I disagree with this statement. I think it is difficult for those not involved at the time to fully appreciate the monumental task of providing estimates. The difficulty of doing so and keeping your own clinical work going was great. I do not believe that I or other clinicians could have done more. I consider the estimates were as good as they could be, given the variables that inevitably arise in the treatment of haemophilia. So those are some of Dr. Main's reflections in 1990 and in 2021 on issues relating to self-sufficiency, both generally and more as they more directly pertain to Northern Ireland. So we have in our written note also set out various matters relating to usage of high purity products in the late 80s and early 90s, and then the introduction of recombinant. I'm not proposing to deal with those now orally, but we have all the references, I think, that are relevant set out in our written note. The position in terms of recombinant appears to be, in terms of the Dr. Main era, that by February 1997, children and all previously untreated patients in Northern Ireland were receiving recombinant. The more up-to-date position in the years that followed Dr. Main's retirement are dealt with in the statement of Dr. Julia Anderson and can be picked up in, with Dr. Benson later this week. I'm therefore going to turn now, sir, to the knowledge of risk of viral infection in Northern Ireland, and in particular on the part of Dr. Main and others concerned with the Haemophilia Centre, both in relation to hepatitis and HIV. And I'm going to deal with those separately and start with the issue of hepatitis. If we begin with what Professor Bridges says in his statement about his perspective, it's at WITN 4569001. And he says, if we go to, so I think it's page 7. He says at the top of the page, I became aware of the risks of hepatitis associated with the use of blood and blood products, but I'm not sure of the exact time. I do not recall being aware of the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis in the 1970s. I would have thought that I would have been aware of the risk of non-A, non-B hepatitis really from the mid-1980s onward. So whether that's right or not will be a matter for your judgment, but it seems that may be likely to be a failure of recollection, given everything else we know about knowledge of hepatitis in the course of the 1970s. In the next paragraph, he says his understanding was that commercial products carried a greater risk of infection because they were sourced from multiple donors, including higher risk groups such as drug addicts and others. So that's Professor Bridges in his statement. I should perhaps just also refer, I think it's probably the bottom of page 11, Shomik. So my pagination's gone awry. Yes, bottom of the page. He was asked about what information was provided to patients. He says, about risks of infection, he says, I was not involved in providing information of this nature to patients. The risk of hepatitis was not widely known during the time I was treating children with cryoprecipitate, that's the 60s and 1970s up to 1979, and therefore there was no discussion with parents about risks. So that is Professor Bridges' current recollection. If we go to PRSE 302268, you'll see these are the minutes of a meeting of Haemophilia Centre directors in January 1977. And if we just go a little further down the list of attendees, we can see that Dr. Bridges was there, representing Royal Victoria Hospital, Belfast. And if we go over the page, we'll see 5 names up from the bottom. Oh, no, next page, sorry. That Dr. Main was also present at this meeting. And then if we go to page... probably page 10 electronically, Shomik. Yep, so we can see the bottom of the page. Study of hepatitis in haemophilic patients, Dr. Krask. Dr. Krask presented a written report to the meeting and outlined the findings detailed therein. 371 patients receiving haemophil had been followed up. Only 1 death was possibly attributable to hepatitis B. Dr. Krask suggested a special study of patients with factor VIII antibodies who may receive large doses of concentrates. Dr. Krask said he would like to continue with his study over the next 2 years. This continued study would include a follow-up of patients who'd had haemophil-associated hepatitis to study the incidence of chronic sequelae and a comparison of jaundice associated with NHS factor VIII and commercial products. And then there's a discussion that then continues about difficulties of identifying causal agents and distinguishing between hepatitis B and non-B hepatitis. So we can see whatever Professor Bridges' recollection now, and obviously he's been asked, being asked about events a number of years following his retirement. This is just one example of a meeting at which he was present, at which there was an active discussion about the incidence of hepatitis as a result of concentrate usage. Turning then to Dr. Main, and Professor Nelson, indeed, in their attendance at meetings. I'm going to spend a little time, so going through the various meetings that occurred throughout the 1970s to pick up on various discussions about hepatitis, to see what one could realistically and reasonably expect those clinicians working at the Belfast Haemophilia Centre to have known and understood. We can start with HCDO 301014. So this takes us all the way back to April of 1971, and we can see Dr. Main in attendance. She's the fourth person there listed. And it's a meeting of the Haemophilia Centre directors held in Oxford. If we go over the page, we can see halfway down the page, Dr. Biggs is giving a short summary of a report on the incidence of jaundice and inhibitors and haemophilic and Christmas disease patients treated during 1969. And then there are various actions set out, including a request for directors to send figures about Australia antigen to her. If we look at, towards the bottom of the page, there's a proposal for publication of the report. And then over the top of the next page, records to be kept and sent to Oxford, including records of those who develop jaundice. And then if we go towards the bottom of this page, there's a discussion under the heading Hepatitis and Australia antigen. The discussion centred on the incidence of Australia antigen and antibody in the haemophilic population and the precautions which should be taken to prevent the spread of infection in the wards and among laboratory staff handling blood samples. And then there's a reference to Dr. Maycock explaining that donor blood would in due course be screened for Australia antigen, but in the meantime the possibility of infection remained. So there's one early discussion which Dr. Main would have been party to early 1971, picking up on the risks of in relation to hepatitis B. We can see, if we look at just some bits and pieces of correspondence, again, issues relating to hepatitis B being raised in relation to Belfast patients. So if we go to BHCT 0000768, this is a letter from Dr. Main to the matron at the Royal Belfast Hospital for Sick Children. It's dated the 12th of January 1973, and it's in respect of a particular patient. And we see from the first paragraph, it's someone who'd commenced nursing studies during August-September 1972 at the Children's Hospital. You may remember he developed jaundice shortly after commencing his preliminary training. This proved to be due to the Australia antigen. He probably became infected during the time intravenous factor VIII concentrate was given to him in May 1972 to cover his dental extractions. The hepatitis was of a mild nature, but the liver enzymes remained abnormal for many months. This in itself was not alarming, but unfortunately his serum has remained positive for the Australia antigen, which means that he's a potential hazard as a source of infection to other people. And we see from the next paragraph, Professor Nelson and Dr. Main are recorded as interviewing him and advising him it would be inadvisable to continue nursing because of the risk of him infecting seriously ill or immunosuppressed patients. So there's hepatitis B as a result of factor VIII concentrates in May of 1972 being considered by Dr. Main and Professor Nelson. There's a further letter at BHCT 40757. This is the 27th of March 1975. If we go to the next page, sorry, it's the documents in reverse order again. So we can see the date, 27th of March 1975. and it's a letter from Dr. Main to, I think it's probably the GP. The above patient who suffers from severe haemophilia, whose blood contains the Australia antigen and who has an inhibitor to factor VIII, was admitted to the haematology unit on the 8th of February 1975, reference there to a bleed. And then in the next paragraph, during this admission, his liver function was assessed to try and discover the damage being caused by the patient's infective hepatitis. And then the liver results are there set out. I'm not going to go to the detail of them, but we can see there again hepatitis B and its effect upon liver function in the active contemplation of Dr. Main. If we then look at various other UKHCDO discussions in the course of the 1970s, we start with HCDO 301015. We can see the minutes of Haemophilia Centre Directors Meeting 27th of October 1972. The list of attendees, we can see the line currently at the bottom of the screen, includes Professor Nelson. If we go over the page, we can see in the bottom half of the page, there's further discussion about Dr. Biggs' survey and the collation of data about the incidence of jaundice. And then if we go 2 pages further on, we see a discussion about a report on the progress with the survey of Australia antigen in house contacts and relatives of haemophiliacs. So that's a particular study being undertaken by Dr. Ingram. And there is also reference here, but I don't think I've got a note of it, about laboratory precautions to be taken to protect staff. I'll come back to that if I can find it, Sarah. I think it's in the course of this meeting that it's discussed. If not, it may be one of the later ones. So that's, again, we see hepatitis essentially as an issue on the agenda at almost every UK HCDO meeting in the course of the 1970s. So that's 1972. We can go next to January 1974. That's Cbla 40187. So we looked at this meeting this morning for different purposes. It's the joint meeting of Haemophilia Centre Directors and Blood Transfusion Directors, 31st of January 1974. If we go over the page, we can see the second name listed is Dr. Main. They're recorded as representing Professor Nelson, Belfast Haemophilia Centre. And we can see again, if we look at the next page, further discussion, top half of the page, about the collection of data in relation to jaundice, and Dr. Biggs urging directors to return that data to Oxford. And then the second half of the page is a report on the progress of the survey of Australia antigen in the household contacts of haemophiliacs. We can then pick the UKHCDO meeting up towards the end of 1974 at HCDO 401017. Sorry, HCDO 301017. So this is the meeting of Haemophilia Centre Directors in Oxford on the 1st of November 1974. Now, it's right to note that nobody from Belfast was in attendance physically at that meeting. Apologies for absence were received from Professor Nelson, but presumably the minutes would have been circulated at some stage, albeit I should, in fairness, if we go to the very top of the page, point out you see the words revised July 1975 at the top of the page, and there is some evidence to suggest that minutes were frequently, or not, sorry, not infrequently sent out some months after the meeting. This may not have come to Professor Nelson's or Dr. Main's attention speedily, but you may wish to consider whether you infer that the minutes would have come to their attention at some point. If we go to page 4, bottom half of the page sees Dr. Biggs presenting results now for 1973 in the study of jaundice. And again, top of the next page, Dr. Biggs urging directors to make returns of the data. And then we see this, report on jaundice following treatment with commercial factor 8. And there's a report by Dr. Krask, and this is of the Bournemouth outbreak. Dr. J. Krask of the Public Health Laboratory, Poole General Hospital, made a report on an epidemic of hepatitis A and B in the haemophilic patients in Bournemouth who had received one particular batch of commercial factor 8. And then there's a reference to some patients having hepatitis A, some hepatitis B. And then the next paragraph says, Dr. Ritzer said that since January 1974, there had been 11 episodes of hepatitis in Oxford patients. 9 of these patients had received commercial concentrates, but all of them had also had NHS concentrate, and it was not easy to identify the material which had caused the jaundice. Neither was it easy to determine the incubation periods. And then there's a discussion about the problems arising from the use of therapeutic materials which might be contaminated with various hepatitis viruses. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but if we go over the page, we can see the discussion continuing. About 10 lines down from the top, we see Dr. Biggs saying it's not yet proved that the commercial factor 8 was much more dangerous from the point of view of causing hepatitis than other preparations. She hoped that this material would not get an unnecessarily bad name. It was in fact clinically invaluable while the NHS supply was so limited. Dr. Krask agreed with this, but said that he felt that a wholly NHS concentrate was likely to be safer when that was available. And then there's reference to Dr. Krask undertaking to draw up a plan to study the incidence of various types of hepatitis at different centres. In fact, I found the reference to the laboratory staff in this document. So there's a discussion at the bottom of the page about the survey of Australia antigen in household contacts of haemophilic patients. If we go to the next page, picking it up 4 lines down, we see a reference to Dr. Waiter, that's the DHSS official attending the meeting, said that the DHSS felt that in laboratories, specimens that were likely to be antigen positive should be identified and staff made aware of the risks. This topic had been raised by Professor Nelson, who was unable to be present at the meeting. So it was a particular issue that Professor Nelson from Belfast had raised in relation to the risk of staff becoming infected with hepatitis B. If we then go to OXUH 303735, we can see these are the minutes of a meeting of Haemophilia Centre directors on the 18th of September 1975. And if we look at the list of attendees, if we go a little further down, we see Dr. Bridges present, representing Belfast. If we then go to page 4, we see the heading there, Progress of the Director's Study of Jaundice and Factor VIII Antibodies. There's presentation of a paper by Dr. Biggs looking at statistics from 1969 to 1974, And then the next paragraph refers to there being a full discussion about the incidence of hepatitis and the problem of anicteric cases. Professor Stewart thought the cases of hepatitis should be more precisely defined according to criteria on which the diagnosis was made. It was felt that future statistics should include LFT, so liver function test results. The others felt that LFT results were often difficult to interpret and not all centres carry out routine LFTs. And then if we go just a few lines further down, we can see 6 lines up from the bottom of the page, a discussion about pool sizes. The influence on the pool size of material used for fractionation was discussed. Professor Ingram said that NHS Factor 8 was derived from pools of 500 to 750 donations, whereas the commercial Factor 8 was often derived from pools of 2,000 to 6,000 litres of plasma, and that the probability of including an infected donation was greater with commercial Factor 8. And the discussion then continues. If we go to page 9, we then see halfway down the page a heading, the proposed pilot study of hepatitis in haemophilic patients. Dr. Krask said that he hoped to continue his study of hepatitis in patients who'd received Hemophil. Just pausing there, of course, as we've seen, Hemophil was a main product in use in Belfast, so one might expect that issues about hepatitis in patients receiving Hemophil would be of particular interest to the Belfast clinicians. There's reference then to Dr. Kirk introducing a paper on a proposal to study the incidence of hepatitis in haemophilia patients, and we see details there set out. It's based at Trelaw, Newcastle and Oxford. And then over the page, 3 lines down, it says there was some discussion about the collection of samples for LFT and virus testing. It was felt it was important to arrange for as many tests as possible, but it was also felt that frequent testing of patients, particularly those on home therapy, could be difficult. Therapeutic material should be saved for virus testing in case new types of tests were developed. So that's the 1975 discussions. If we then just look at Cbla 40312, so this is the paper that was described as being circulated at that meeting. So again, a paper that would have come to the attention of Belfast clinicians on this occasion through Dr. Bridges' attendance at the meeting. Again, I won't go through the detail of it, but we can see it's the protocol for the prospective study. And it says this in the introduction: the transfusion of blood or its derivatives has been linked with the transmission of viral hepatitis for many years. And then it talks about the discovery of the Australia antigen and matters set out in relation to that. And then it says, just above paragraphs A, B and C, this failure to prevent post-transmission hepatitis may be explained by the following hypotheses. A is that the current methods of detecting Australia antigen are still not sensitive enough. B, that other known viral agents are responsible. And then C, that other as yet unknown viruses cause a significant amount of post-transfusion hepatitis, which is supported by the recent work of Feinstein et al.
Now that publication was in the NEJM, New England Journal of Medicine, I think, which, from all the evidence we've heard, is one of the most commonly read reports by clinicians other than the BMJ and the Lancet.
Yes, and it was in the New England Journal of Medicine, published in 1975.
Yes.
As we'll see, there's also a reference in this paper to the Prince publication in a perhaps lesser well-known journal, Transfusion and Immunology, in 1975, but summarised and referred to in this document. And we'll see that the next paragraph then talks about the particular issue of risk issues associated with large pool factor concentrates. Picking it up halfway down that paragraph, it says, however, treatment with factor VIII concentrates does expose the patient to a much larger risk of contracting transfusion hepatitis, since the fractionated product is processed from donor pools. Furthermore, commercial factor VIII concentrates are made from very large pools of some 2,000 to 6,000 litres of plasma from paid donors. An outbreak of both non-B hepatitis and B hepatitis associated with concentrates of this type has recently been reported by Krask et al. And that's a reference to the 1975 publication in The Lancet of Dr. Krask's write-up of his observations in relation to Bournemouth. And it's the article entitled An Outbreak of Hepatitis Associated with Intravenous Injection of Factor VIII Concentrate. So the risk there, both in terms of hepatitis B and non-B hepatitis, also known as non-A, non-B hepatitis, clearly being articulated here. And then the next paragraph says it's been suggested by Prince, and that's the 1975 publication in Transfusion and Immunology, that recipients of all commercial blood have a 10-fold higher risk of developing non-B post-transfusion hepatitis, so non-A, non-B, than recipients of all volunteer donor blood. And that's then the reason that's given for conducting this prospective study of hepatitis. The rest of the paper then goes on to provide details about what the study will entail. But the evidence clearly shows that this was circulated at that September 1975 meeting. If we then go to 1977, PRSE 301002. So these are the minutes of the meeting of the Haemophilia Centre Directors, 24th of October 1977. If we go to page 3, we will see from the list of attendees, bottom half of the page, left-hand column, that we have Professor Nelson there from Belfast. The apologies tell us that Dr. Main was invited, but gave her apologies for absence. And then there's, if we go to, sorry, Shimit, it's page 7, I think. At bottom of the page, hepatitis study. We see reference there to Dr. Kirk presenting a report on behalf of Dr. Krask. So this is now a report in relation to the progress of the study. And if we go 2 pages, no, sorry. Give me a moment. I think, Seamus, it's going to be electronic page 19. It's page 10 using the actual page numbers, but we appear to have lots of blank pages in. That's it. Under the heading, halfway down the page, Hepatitis Working Party, we can see Dr. Krask presenting Dr. Kirk presenting a report on behalf of Dr. Krask, a suggestion about information being collected regarding patients who are hepatitis B carriers, and some directors expressing concern about that. And then the next paragraph, there then followed a discussion of the advisability of liver biopsy in haemophiliacs. The consensus was that each case must be considered individually, and in particular the Hepatitis Working Party should be informed of any such patients. And of course, the very fact of there being even a discussion of liver biopsies in haemophiliacs would tend to suggest that the risks of hepatitis and the need to examine whether and to what extent there were chronic consequences from hepatitis was something that was taken seriously and regarded as an important issue for discussion. So that's the 1977 meeting. It's right to note that in the course of 1977 and 1978, the Hepatitis Working Party began to meet on a very regular basis. Now, nobody from Belfast was a member of the Hepatitis Working Party. But again, if we trace through each of the sets of minutes, we see regular reports being made by someone on behalf of the Hepatitis Working Party, usually Dr. Krask, not always, as we see here, it was Dr. Kirk, updating Haemophilia Centre directors on the work of the Hepatitis Working Party. And we can see, if we go to Cbla 40681_009, it seems likely from various documents, including the date, that this was the report that was being discussed in that 1977 meeting. It's described as Haemophilia Directors, Hepatitis Working Party, Hepatitis Associated Commercial Factor 8, 1976. But the report's actually dated the 22nd of September, 1977. And you'll see it's referred to as Appendix C, and it was Appendix C that it's referred to in the minutes. And we'll see again, it updates the Haemophilia Centre directors, so that would include the Belfast representatives, about the progress of the study of haemophil. And we can see from the very opening paragraph, as a continuation of the study of haemophil begun in 1974, it was decided to study the incidence of hepatitis after transfusions of cryobuline in 1976, and to compare this with that due to haemophil. So the two commercial products in use in Belfast, here the focus of this study. If we look at the results, returns were received from 24 haemophilia centres. I'm afraid I think no way of knowing if that included Belfast. There was epidemiological evidence that 2 out of 6 batches of haemophil and 2 out of 16 batches of cryobuline contained hepatitis B virus. Similarly, 4 out of 6 batches of haemophil and I think that's 3 out of 17, but it could be 5 batches of cryobuline were associated with cases of non-B hepatitis. And then it refers to information about patients. Under the heading Hepatitis B, a little further down the page, it refers to 2 cases of hepatitis B occurring in patients previously known to have had transfusions of haemophil. And then over the page, we see the heading non-B hepatitis, so non-A, non-B. Cases of haemophil-associated non-B hepatitis have continued to occur, all in patients receiving haemophil for the first time, and that is then discussed further. And then there's reference, you'll see the heading further down, multiple attacks of hepatitis. So reference to patients having more than one attack of hepatitis. And then if we go to the next page, under the heading conclusions, it said these results indicate it's essential to continue these studies with the object of answering the following questions. The first is about the effect of the hepatitis B screening, but the second is the number of types and incidence of non-B hepatitis, and then the third is the incidence of sequelae after acute hepatitis, so looking at chronicity effectively and chronic effects. And then detail is given of further projects proposed. So that's a paper which the documents would tend to suggest would have been shared, was shared with the Haemophilia Centre directors, at least those attending that meeting, which in relation to that meeting included Professor Nelson. So I've still got a number of further documents to look at in relation to issues of hepatitis and knowledge of risk. So perhaps this is a useful moment to take a break.
Yes, well, let's do that and come back at 4:45.